As we get started, I just want to say thank you very much to today's guest speaker, Michael Anhorn, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Mental Health Association for Vancouver Fraser. His office is in New Westminster, just a half block away from our office. So it's, even though we seem quite far apart, we're actually pretty close together most of the time. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the New Westminster Record and the City of New Westminster, for participating in this series and helping us to get the word out and support this community. I'd like to say thank you to Councillor McAvoy, who has come to listen and really understand from a leadership perspective how the city can take care of this business community. And thank you all for being here. I think this is a very, very important conversation. And I'm very grateful to have someone so experienced with mental health as part of this, to really kind of start the conversation as a community on how we can take care of each other. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so we can just get into a speaker view here. If you have any questions, this is really intended to be, really a conversation. One of my goals here is that everyone here really learns something new about mental health, and maybe for their own well-being or how to take care of others. We also maybe come up with some ideas as a community and as leaders on how we can support this community moving forward. I think we're just at the beginning of the impacts of this crisis in terms of mental health. People can manage for a certain amount of time with increased stress and anxiety, but as that continues, it has more and more impacts. And so I think that it's really important as leaders for us to understand how to mitigate those impacts, but also how to address them as they come up. So let me just see here. I think I've got the right view here. Once again, I'm just going to change the chat so I can get rid of the participants. I'm not sure if you guys can see that or not. Still trying to figure out exactly what's seen by people as I go along, and that's I get that figured out eventually. I had some great feedback from some of our members saying that I should have a co-host, and I thought that was a great idea. But when I tried to add a co-host, I would have had to make everyone who registered re-register, because I did it too late. So that will be something we have for next time, so that I can help to be more focused in this conversation. So really, I just want to go back and say the purpose of this conversation is for the leaders of this community to explore how do we support the businesses moving forward as the impacts of this pandemic continue to grow. And I hope that each of you will walk away with a tip on maybe how to notice when your staff or your families or yourself is being impacted by mental health. The thing that I really understand about mental health is that even though it's more accepted, even though there's more awareness about it, people are willing to talk about it when it's about someone else. But it's when it's about yourself, when it's about showing vulnerability and non-invincibility, oftentimes we stop ourselves from sharing, and that is exactly the thing that keeps us locked into the patterns that may not be healthy. You didn't come here to talk to me, so I'm going to turn it over to Michael here. Michael is once again the Executive Director of the Canadian Mental Health Association, Vancouver Fraser, and we're excited to have a conversation with him. Michael, now, why don't we start with what have you been dealing with and hearing from the community around, I guess, dealing with mental health during this crisis? And welcome.
Oh, thank you, and I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a little unfortunate that we're doing this in the middle of a pandemic, but I'm really thrilled that so many people are paying attention to mental health, I think, in a way that they haven't before. And I'm just really honored to be here. Our organization, so as you mentioned, we have offices in New Westminster. But we serve people across Metro Vancouver. And so we've got offices in Vancouver, Delta, Maple Ridge, and then services in other places. And we've gone through this ourselves, right? As a mental health organization, we did all of our service delivery in person. And I think very lucky that we're an essential service. So we are able to still continue to serve our program participants. But we had to pivot our entire operation in less than 2 weeks. We went from probably 90% in-person service delivery to 100% virtual in less than 2 weeks. Staff that thought they would never do virtual services, who now are doing virtual services and had to learn the technology and had to learn how to build relationships through a computer screen and instead of in person. And we didn't get it all right, is the other thing I think I want to say. I think there were a lot of things we got right, and then a lot that we had to learn as we went. I've done a lot of work over the years in disaster response, mostly with the Canadian Red Cross. So I had an experience of how to respond to a disaster as a leader. But the very first thing that experience teaches you is that you know nothing, and that in disasters, you're faced with situations that have never been dreamt of before, and yet you've got to find a way to respond. And, so thankfully I had that experience. And this disaster, this pandemic, is different than anything we've experienced before, at least in my lifetime. When I worked for the Red Cross, if there was a fire, a forest fire or wildfire, it impacted a region. And I could phone my colleagues a province away and they were calm and collected and it wasn't impacting them. Now, if I phone my colleagues 2 provinces away, they're as impacted as I am. So everything has changed in our world, and we're all making this up as we go. And I want to just acknowledge that is stressful for all of us. And I think especially stressful for leaders because we're used to having some sense of knowing what to do. And right now, all the normal cause and effect relationships that we thought we knew, for the most part, have been thrown up into the air, and we're having to re-figure out what's working in this new environment and what doesn't work. And we're doing that while our staff often, if they're still employed, and if they're not, that's a whole nother stressor. But if they are still employed and working with us, they're not physically near us. And so it does really complicate it. And I'm looking forward to talking about some of the strategies we found and some of the things that I learned through disaster response. And just before we go any further, I do want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's been a very helpful framing for me in both understanding our staff's response to what's going on and in understanding my own. So in disaster response, there's 4 phases that they talk about of a disaster response, but the 2 that I'm going to focus on is disaster response, and that's when the disaster first happens. It's about mitigating any further damage, and it's about keeping people safe, and and that's really all it's about. It's not usually about long-term planning in the first little bit. It's just stop further damage, get people safe, and keep them safe. In that time, most people are just thrilled to be getting support of any kind, thrilled that someone is trying to stop the damage, right? And with this pandemic, it's a little different because when is that disaster response over? I don't think we have a clear answer to that. In an earthquake, you've got a much clearer answer of when that threat is over. The next phase after disaster response is disaster recovery. And in disaster recovery, that's when communities get to start choosing how they want to be in their new normal. How do we want to be as a community? How do we want to be as an organization or a corporation? And personally, how do I want to be in the world? One of the things I've seen from disasters is, although we talk about going back to normal, it's never the same as it was before. And I think there's some opportunity in that. But it does then lead to some anxiety as well, because if it's not how it was, what is it going to be? And none of us have crystal balls, or if you do and it works, please talk to me afterwards. But we don't know for sure what that's going to be. And so how do we start to prepare ourselves and have those conversations? And my recommendation is to base those on our values. So to go back to who am I as a person, what's important to me, what's important to my organization or my company, and then how do we make choices to say our new normal is going to reflect and incorporate those values. The other thing to know about those phases, I talk about them as if they're two distinct and separate and clean phases. But the reality is every community and every person and every organization and every person in every organization is going to go through those at different times. So some people will be like, oh, I feel safe. I'm ready to start thinking about the future. Other people are going to be, I still feel very threatened, and all I can think about is my immediate safety. And
Michael, go ahead.
As leaders, we need to find a way to try and make room for all of those reactions. And I think about it as change management. A lot of the change management theory talks about how people go through reactions to change at different times. And it's the same in a disaster. People move through their emotional and physical responses at a different rate. Doesn't make it easier for leaders, but if we understand where they're coming from on the continuum, it may make us able to be more accepting of what their response is. Sorry, Rnold.
No, that's okay. I was just when you said that, it made me think of how do you know, or do you have some sense of like, how do you know where someone's at? Like, what are some of the signs? And I think this is really important just to understand, because again, people rarely say, hey, I'm drowning or I'm underwater. Now, sometimes they do, and we say, oh, that's great. But what are some kind of signs when people aren't saying that they're still either in that kind of first phase where they're just happy for anything, or they're kind of ready? What, any ideas for like what kind of signs you might have?
Yeah, so I think when people are talking about, well, let's in this specific example of the pandemic, if people are still talking about almost exclusively about how to avoid getting infected, about lack of cleaning supplies or personal protective equipment, or if they're trying to figure out how to get to work without interacting with anyone else, those for me are signs that they're still very much in the response and that they're still feeling threatened, highly threatened by the virus. I also want to be clear, even when we get mostly into the recovery phase, the virus is likely still going to be in our community, so there will still be some level of threat. When people start questioning the decisions that leaders have made in the middle of the disaster, that's one of the first signs that they're moving into recovery. So generally in disaster response time, like I said, people are just happy that someone is doing something. As they start to move into recovery, and as the community starts to move into recovery, they're going to start second guessing every decision that every leader has made. Maybe not every decision, that's maybe a bit pedantic, but they're going to start questioning a lot of the decisions. In every disaster of recovery and response and recovery I've been a part of, that questioning has started to happen. And although it can be hard for leaders, because suddenly, we were making the best decisions we could with the information we had at the time, and now our decisions are being judged on different information and new information. So that can be a bit hard for leaders. But that's a sign that your team is starting to move into recovery and starting to be able to lift up their heads from daily survival to what's next for me. So that's one of the things that I look for. And probably the biggest, to be honest, is if people start questioning the decisions that I made, or in our case in BC, the decisions that Dr. Bonnie Henry made, probably is a sign that the feeling of threat, the immediate threat, is starting to go down, and that people are probably ready to start talking about what's next and planning, starting to plan more than 30 seconds out, right? Plan for the next day, the next week, the next months.
Well, and I think it's really interesting what you said is that everybody comes at that from a different time frame. And I think that's one of the things that also, as a challenge for leaders, is when you're dealing with a group of people, how do you kind of craft your response to the person as opposed to the organization or the community?
Yeah.
And I kind of chuckled when you said, so as soon as they start questioning you, that's when that's actually a good sign. So I guess that's a positive sign.
Yeah.
Things are going really well for the people who I'm dealing with then.
And it doesn't necessarily feel positive. I'll be really honest about that. But
Mm.
when I'm able to take a step back and look at it and go, oh, this is where it's coming from, and I'm like, okay, good. We can start moving forward again. Yeah. So
I think one of the things and I just want to say, I thank you to Councillor Nadine Nakagala for coming. I asked both Jamie, I put a call out to some of the councillors in the city. I said, I'd love to have you come and join in this conversation. I think it's really important to help people to understand how to deal with that. So I just noticed that she joined us, and I wanted to say thank you for coming, Nadine. I really appreciate that. I think one of the other things that's super important for leaders to understand when you're leading through a crisis is, what are the signs that someone isn't coping well? Or, I think there's into that shifting from, disaster response to recovery. We've got but what about if someone's kind of, not saying anything, but maybe struggling? How can you tell? Are some signs?
so the signs are almost the same, probably, yeah, are basically the same as in any other time. So if you notice a change in behavior, uh, whatever that change is, that's a sign that someone may be starting to struggle. So it could be someone who's you experience as always happy and always looking at the optimistic side of life, suddenly isn't able to laugh or isn't able to look at the potential good. That's a sign. Or if it's someone who, and we all know people that are sort of by nature pretty pessimistic, if suddenly they start acting like everything is okay, that would be a sign for me, because it's a dramatic change in behavior. That's a sign for me that I'd want to have further conversations with them about how they're doing. Um, Sometimes the signs are obvious, like not able to manage their emotions. So either they have outbursts of crying or of anger. Uh, their responses seem to not be correlated with the events that have triggered the immediate events that have triggered the response. Those are some of the things that I would look for. And I would be most concerned if they last any period of time. We all have bad days, right? Goodness knows I've lost my temper sometimes in places that probably wasn't worth it. But if I do that once and I pull myself back together and I'm okay, I'm less concerned about that than if you saw me in 2 or 3 days in a row and that was happening, or a week and that was happening every time. That for me is when I would start to really think I need to follow up with the person and just open a conversation about how they're doing. And again, I also want to be clear on this. It's not, as leaders of organizations, it's not necessarily up to us to solve it.
Mm.
But it is up to us to open those conversations and to inquire about how people are doing, and then to have resources available to connect them with. And right now in BC, the Canadian Mental Health Association has a COVID-19 resource webpage. It's cmha.bc.ca/COVID-19. And so if you don't have existing resources, I would encourage you to go there and look at what resources are available during this time. And don't forget that you may have extended health benefits that may include psychological counseling, and you may have an employee and family assistance program. And even if you've told your staff about that many, many times, when they are in a crisis, they may not remember it, and it's worth reminding them that those services are there for them.
You said you started, actually kind of answered both two questions. One is, what do you do when you notice that someone is struggling? And then also, what are some of the resources available? I'd love to dig into those just a little bit deeper. So how do you frame that conversation, or what is an approach that you can have if someone's in that place of struggle? How can you approach them so you don't make them maybe feel bad for it, or any suggestions on how to enter into that conversation?
Yeah, and that it's a bit of a tough one to answer, in part because it does depend on the relationship you have with the person. And, different people respond to different type of approaches. Um, One of the approaches I use that seems to work fairly well for a lot of different people is a question that on the surface sounds simple, and that's how are you?
Mm,
Just as simple as how are you? And most people in our society are trained to say fine.
mm,
And so if they say fine, push a little further, probe a little further, and say, well, I've noticed, here's what I've noticed over the last few days. So, how are you really doing? And again, it needs to be from a genuine place of concern or caring and concern, not of performance management in this conversation. There may be another time for performance management, but this conversation really needs to be clearly about concern and care for the person. Um, and in my experience, like I said, the first time you ask, people will usually say fine. Just it is the socially acceptable answer in our society. The second time you ask it, and especially if you say some of the behaviors you've noticed, usually people will open up, even if it's just a little bit more. And that then gives you as a leader room to say, can I help you find help?
mm.
Um, right. So if their second answer is like, yeah, I'm really struggling, like, and whatever the story is, then that allows you to say, can I help you find some resources? Because again, and as leaders, sometimes, and I don't mean to be sexist, but often, particularly male leaders, think they need to fix it.
Mm.
And we don't. But we do need to help people find the resources that can help them fix it. So yeah, just those simple questions, and knowing that sometimes our first answer isn't the fully honest answer.
Now, Michael, when you talk about accessing resources, what is it? What is the best way to? Is it about a hotline? Is it about a conversation? What do you think is the best way to do that?
Again, it really depends on the person and on where they're at. Um, Again, some people will want to do their own research, and
Mm,
so if you can point them to a website or 211 is a resource line here in BC. Then they'll do their own research. They do, and especially in an employment area, some people don't want their employer involved in that. Others, you may need to help a bit more and say, well, hey, on this website COVID-19, I've read about bounce back
mm,
for people struggling with anxiety and low mood. It's telephone based. Is that something that you might find helpful? Oh no, not that. Well, what about we've got our employee and family assistance program. So
mm.
so you do have to judge it as a leader on the person and what you know of them, and on kind of how they respond. So if you say, hey, here's a website where you might be able to get it, and they say like some version of I'm too overwhelmed, there's no way I can process that, then you've got to step it down a bit more and make sure that you break down and say, well, why don't you try this? Right? That didn't work. Okay, try this. One of the things we know about mental health is different people respond differently to different programs and services. So the right service for one person may be the absolute wrong service for someone else. And so it's really important that if they don't get it right the first time, that they keep trying different services. And if all of this is beyond what you're comfortable with or beyond your level of knowledge as a leader, the other thing you can always do is encourage them to talk to their family physician.
Mm.
And I know in these times, one, in BC, not everyone has them. But two, people may be nervous about it. But these mental, especially if someone's starting to edge towards a mental illness, the earlier and the sooner they get help, the better their outcomes are, their long-term outcomes are. So this is a really valid and important reason to connect with a physician now. And as we've been hearing, from Dr. Bonnie Henry and others, our physicians are there to help us right now. Even if we're a little bit scared of going into their office, they're there for us. And so you may need to remind them, and there's always options of video conferences and teleconferences with their doctors. So there may be ways that they don't have to leave their home and still can get that help.
Thank you. What are some of the things that you can do as an organization or as a leader? What kind of processes can you put in place that kind of, I guess, maybe prevent people, going in the downward spiral? Or what are some of the things that you've seen or maybe have suggested to organizations to keep people on the good side of the ledger in terms of well-being?
Right. So I want to start by talking about things to do in the middle of a disaster response and recovery.
Okay, yeah.
Because that's where we're at, right? So one of the most important things we can do is regular and predictable and caring communication to our teams. So it's one of my staff people had described my communication over this time as a 4P model, or a 3P model, and then I added a fourth. So she said that my communication had been personal. So I use I statements, and I talk about you instead of the employee, right? So I don't use third person, I use first person. And also as part of that personal, I'm comfortable with this, but I talked about days when I was struggling. Emotional responses in a disaster tend to be a bit of a roller coaster that is not triggered necessarily by anything externally that we can identify except the disaster. So we'll have good days in a disaster, and we'll have days when we think the world is falling apart. And I was able to let our staff know when I was having some bad days and when I was having good days. And I was able to say to them, that's part of the normal response. So that personal aspect to communication is really important. Pastoral is the second P that our staff person identified, and that's a sense of caring. So communicate to your team that you care about them. Again, that needs to be legitimate. If you fake that in a disaster response, our bullshit meters are on high alert. So don't pretend, but if you do legitimately care about your team, let them know that. Personal, pastoral, and practical. Make sure you've got information in your communications that people can instantly do something with and that impact their safety, and make sure that information is accurate. So we, from the beginning of the response, said all the information we were going to get to staff was going to come from BC's provincial health officer, so Dr. Bonnie Henry and her team. And they knew they could trust that, right? They work in healthcare. They have a sense that that's a trustworthy source. The P that I added was predictable. So we told our staff at the beginning of this response that we were going to communicate with them around 2 o'clock every day. And I did miss a couple of days because of meetings, but for the most part, we got an email out at or about 2 o'clock every day that updated them on our response, that updated them on the pandemic in general, and that updated them on the latest safety information. One of the things in a disaster, and it's been very true in this pandemic, is that our understanding of what's happening changes rapidly. And it's not that it was wrong before, it's we have more information now. And so we did that. Now, we've identified that we're now at a plateau in our response. So last week, in our email communications to staff, we said, we think we're at a plateau. We're going to go from next week. So we foreshadowed it. Next week, we're going to go from daily to twice a week. But we reserve the right to go back to daily if everything starts changing all the time again. So again, and that was about keeping it predictable. So, it's not that you can't change how often or when you communicate, but make sure you flag for people when that change is going to happen so that if it doesn't happen, they don't go, oh my God, what happened to Michael? Is he in the hospital with COVID-19? Right? Because humans' brains often go to the worst case scenario really quickly. Or is our organization going bankrupt because we didn't get the email on time? Like, those are very normal reactions to a very abnormal situation. And so the more we can keep something predictable, the more we'll be helping our staff.
That's great. Michael, I'm going to open up to everybody. One of the things that we want to make sure we do is give Michael some information about what we think the community might need in terms of support, so that he can bring that back to his organization and see what else can be done besides what's already being done, or maybe even target it. Maybe it's more information, maybe it's more, but that's something that we're looking at, is how can we support this community. But I want to make sure that people understand. They always say and when the oxygen mask drop in an airplane, you put your own mask on first before you help your child. And I think that as leaders, it's really important for us to understand, how do we care for ourselves? How do we make sure as leaders we're all taking care of our own well-being? Because oftentimes we'll just go to the nth degree and then we burn out and are no help to anybody. What are the key things for your own personal well-being?
Yeah. Again, this will change from person to person, but so the key thing is to find what works for you. But some of the general things that we know works. One is keep a routine. So my routine got totally thrown up into the air when I started working from home and stopped going into the office. So I had to find a new routine so that my brain kind of knew what to expect when. I also have a dog, so it was important that my dog knew what to expect when. And kids also need to know what to expect when. So find a routine that works for you. Make sure that you keep meaningful activity in your life. So if you have hobbies, try to stay engaged in the hobbies. If you don't have hobbies, now would be a great time to learn a new one. And even if they're a bit frustrating at the beginning, it helps us later on. The other thing I've been saying all through this is the importance of getting outside and staying active. Keeping our bodies active, there's increasing evidence that shows that helps our mental health. So whether it's for a walk, a bike ride, again, maintaining the physical distancing that we need to, but staying active is really important. And then the other thing I would say is, if you notice that you're suffering emotionally, to reach out for help and to be that role model of someone who is trying to proactively take care of themselves. The response to this pandemic is a marathon. It's going to last probably months, maybe more than a year. And we can't run full out for that long as human beings. So if we approach this as a sprint, well, at least I would be flat out on the sidewalk somewhere and not able to do anything except breathe. So really think about, how do you measure your energy so that you're not expending all of it now, because we're going to have to keep this up for quite some time. And that includes things like making sure if you've got people on your team you can delegate to, do that. And if you've got a leadership team with you, make sure that that leadership team is as supportive as it can be, and that people are willing to do what's needed to be done, even if it's not necessarily their job, right? So that team becomes a team and is more than the individual and individual job descriptions on it.
One of the things I've always found so fascinating about how humans work is that the things that take care of us, we don't feel like doing them when we need to do them. Like we don't feel like exercising. That's exactly what we need to do. When we don't feel like reaching out. One of the things that I'd like to add is, when you reach out to take care of someone else, that has a really beneficial effect. And sometimes if you don't feel comfortable saying that you're struggling, helping someone else can actually lift your spirits just as well. And sometimes that will help you to lead into saying, well, I'm actually struggling, or having that conversation. So that's a nice mental trick that you can do to just be able to take action. And as a leader, I think that you feel that when you can take care of your staff, or when you make a difference for someone that you're working with, you can see that buoys your spirits as well. And I think that's one way to do that. Any other strategies before we move? Go ahead, Michael. What were you going to say?
Sorry, yeah. So just one more strategy, and your comment reminded me of it, and that's the importance of staying connected emotionally and socially connected to the people that are important to us. So I know that can be harder in this time when we have to maintain physical distancing, but finding ways to reach out to our friends and loved ones and family is so important, and again, does a world of good for our mental health.
That's awesome. I'm just going to go switch to gallery view for a second here. Thanks again, everybody who's here. I'd like to just kind of crowdsource some tips. What are you doing, if you're brave enough to share? What are you doing to take care of your own mental health, or what's really working for you? I hope that's okay, Michael, to just kind of see what's out there in the community. Does anybody is brave enough to offer a tip? Not all at once now. Oh, you want to unmute you? Go ahead, Scott.
Scott here. I think it's really important on the routine piece and so on. I've been going flat out for about a week and a half there, and it was exhausting. But now I'm back into a routine, and it's everything's back to where it's supposed to be. So I think that's good. And in terms of the friends and family, I'm doing weekly Zoom calls with my mom and the folks back in Ontario. So it's all good. I think that's really important advice.
Thanks, Scott. And Victoria, our operations coordinator, says that cooking, there's lots of great things to try. I know that I've started making bread, and I've never really done that before. And I love to cook, but so that's been a really interesting process. And my kids love that fresh baked bread coming out of the oven. So that's been a good mental health aspect. And just going to go to the chat here. I think they're making a few cool things here. So David says, make sure you're caring for others. I think that is so important. I love that. Penny says, keeping routine and then keeping touch with friends and family. I think that's one of the things. I know for me, it is so hard. You get so busy that you forget to build in that reach out time. And so if that time to reach out to friends and family, and maybe some of you are better at it than I am, but I know that if I know at 4 o'clock or 4:30, that's the time that I'm going to do that. Sometimes that helps to make sure that you're actually taking those actions, and you can rotate through the people that you might not normally speak to, because it's usually the people that we don't hear from are the ones that are struggling, the ones who won't necessarily reach out because they might be in that fog. So, Quinn says he doesn't have a microphone, but a lunch daily. Oh, a daily walk. Yeah, I love that. They call that in Japan forest bathing. I think that there's a lot of research that suggests that just being around nature can lift your spirits as well. Let's see what else we got here. Keeping routine, spending. Actually doing things that you enjoy. Thanks, Nimi. That's a good choice. Actually making time for your hobbies. It's so crazy that in this day and age, we're just locked in. And I know that one of the things that always gives me joy is just seeing my 3-year-old daughter and giving her a hug. And I think that in our society, oftentimes that loving touch is underrated. But I think research shows that if you actually hug for more than 30 seconds, that's when you really get the full benefits of that touch. So, long hugs. That's my suggestion. As Charlotte Diamond used to say, 4 hugs a day, that's the minimum. Anyway, look at this. Oh, Nadine, not a tip. I'm just going to read this, Nadine, hopefully. But I think that we need to add some nuance about gender, race, disability, class, etc., in terms of mental health support. Okay, there's something for you, Michael. And that was actually going to be the next thing I was going to go to, is what kind of things can we go to? I'm going to keep reading that. So we know, for example, that women of color have their concerns more often dismissed by medical professionals. I'd love to hear Michael comment on some cultural aspects of mental health. Thank you, Nadine. What an excellent contribution. Now, go ahead, Michael. I'm going to go back to speaker view to give you some.
Sure. So Nadine, yeah, you've definitely identified that correctly, and it's it's, I don't think it's acceptable. We've been doing a lot of work in our organization to try and make sure that we understand how different people talk about mental health, and different people from different backgrounds talk about mental health, because it's not universal, right? How the culture we're raised in will change how we view mental health. And it also changes the resources we have available to us. So it's like, I do agree in our Western medical system, people from diverse backgrounds, people of color, racialized people are often not taken as seriously, or sometimes not taken as seriously in terms of mental health concerns. Another way of looking at that is there's also sometimes different resources in different cultures. So, in cultures that have more of an extended family, there's often more of a support network that people have access to. Again, that doesn't mean there's no mental health concerns or no mental illness. It means that it's dealt with differently. I also would want to acknowledge that many First Nations view mental health in a very different way than settlers do in North America. There's both a respect and an honor for the different gifts that people bring to it, and that difference is often seen as a gift instead of as a problem. But also that wellness is seen much more broadly, and understood to be much more broad. And I wouldn't want to talk about it in too much depth because it's not the tradition that I come from. But just when I've had the privilege of sitting with elders, when they talk about mental wellness, it's in a very different way than I would have talked about it. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that there are also traditional ceremonies and cultural practices that can help in ways that those of us not from those cultures may have some trouble understanding and may not think of right away. But helping someone to connect or reconnect with their identity and with their culture and cultural practices can be helpful if that's something they're seeking.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Two more tips, as Jamie says, limit screen time, and David says gardening. And I think that that's one of the things. I'm pretty sure you have to turn 40 before you're allowed to garden, though. So I'm not sure if that's an accurate thing, but I've heard that apparently 40 is the magic age where gardening becomes becomes the time when you garden. I'd like to open it up again. We can do it by a chat or by just unmuting your microphone. I think we have a small enough and well-behaved group that I'm happy to trust you to do that. And this is really an opportunity to say to Michael, what do you think this community needs as we move forward in terms of supporting mental health? And perhaps we don't know yet. Perhaps we haven't seen, but there's people who have lost their jobs. There's businesses whose margins are going to be cut short. There's going to be, a debt that we need to repay. How do we support this business community to actually weather this crisis in the best possible way? And Jamie, if you have any thoughts, or maybe it's what are you seeing that people need, or if you've got, and maybe this is just not on people's minds. I don't know. It's kind of interesting, but what do you think, Michael? How are we going to overcome the fear associated with the virus, and really kind of support this community to kind of get back into action?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think, well, my hope is in part by opening up the conversations on mental health and mental illness. And I do want to take a moment. So when I talk about mental health, I think of it as physical health. So it's that well-being, state of well-being, state of being able to do what I want to do and be productive in the way that I want to be productive. When I talk about mental illness, that's actually illness, like a physical illness. And I know that's not everyone's shared language around it. So I just want to say so, and that mental health is a continuum like physical health is, right? It's not just you're sick or you're well, but there's varying degrees of wellness and illness. And so helping people build skills to open up those conversations, I think, is one of the ways we will support ourselves both in the immediate and in the long term. The other thing I think is really important is helping people to build skills related to their resilience. So learning how to cope with stress, learning how to identify when we're starting to struggle rather than when we're so unwell that we can't function, right? So, and those are skills and knowledge that we can learn and practice. And it's not about getting them right, but it's about starting those conversations, starting that learning. CMHA just released a webinar on resilience in the front line. It is mostly with frontline medical professionals in mind, but the content and the tips and tricks are applicable to almost everyone. And that's free. I think it's on our website, and if not, it's definitely on the provincial website. And so helping those conversations to happen, and then helping managers and supervisors to learn how to open those conversations and support an employee through those when an employee may be struggling. So that, I think, as much, and I think there's other things, right? Like our mental health system doesn't have a lot of, or our public health system doesn't have a lot of mental health supports, especially for people with mild to moderate symptoms. Severe mental illness, we've got supports for. Again, probably not enough, but we have them. But for people with low mood, with anxiety, it's really hard to get support from our public mental health system. So I do think we need to address that. But even before then, I think learning how to talk to one another about mental health, mental wellness, and when you're struggling, and learning how to take care of ourselves. I think many of us assume we know how to take care of ourselves, but there are some really specific things we can do to increase our resilience to stress and adversity. And taking some time to learn those and to practice them is really important.
Very good. I see that Jamie has raised his hand. Jamie, why don't you go ahead and jump in? What was that related to the question? Well, what do you have to say, Jamie? Go ahead.
Well, what I would say is the most important thing is reaching out, and that means you can call 211, you can call your doctor, you can call the crisis center of Greater Vancouver, and I'll post their phone number in the chat. But or you can reach out to anyone in your life who you think is supportive. But the important thing is to acknowledge the problem. And then take a step to get help. Don't try to deal with it on your own. And it's a pretty stressful time. I mean, dealing with isolation in a pandemic, nearly everyone is stressed to some degree about that. And then people who've lost their jobs, which is often ranked as one of the most affecting crises that people can go through. So where you sort of have a double whammy, it's pretty natural to be affected at this point. And we talk a lot about kindness. Dr. Henry talks about kindness, and a good way to be kind to yourself is to get some help if you need it.
Thanks, Jamie. I think Nadine has a great point. Is oftentimes when people talk about mental health and well-being, it's about self-soothing and more, he said, and individualistic, and sometimes often targeted people with resources. Go to and so how do we move towards community resilience and well-being? So that's a bit of a challenging question. So Michael, there you go. Solve this small little challenge we have.
Well, so I love this question. I have long done work in community development and community capacity building, and I don't think that mental wellness occurs in isolation. I think it occurs in community. So one thing that I have seen work really well, and it's happening in a rural part of Salt Spring Island, is they've created what they call care pods. And it's in part basically a phone tree where neighbors call one another and see how they're doing. But it's also, they're using it to plan things like food security for one another. So who has space for gardening, right? Now, again, rural area, quite different than Vancouver. And I do think some of the way we get to community wellness is by reestablishing that notion of neighborhood and neighbor and building those connections. And it's hard in a large urban setting because many of us moved here for the anonymity. Right? I grew up in a town of 55 people in rural Saskatchewan. There was no anonymity there. Part of what drew me to Vancouver was that I wasn't going to know everyone I ran into on the street every day. But there's a downside to that. And so how do we balance that and make sure that we've got people in our lives that we can depend on, who can depend on us, and that we can problem solve together? And particularly around financial resources, not all of us are privileged enough or privileged in that way. And so how do we build connections? And I don't have all the answers, but I think encouraging people that live in proximity to talk to one another is part of the way to do that. Also recognizing when and where that's happening. I worked in the downtown east side for a little bit, and I think a lot of people in the Metro Vancouver region see that neighborhood in one particular way, and don't necessarily see the strong social connections that exist in part of that neighborhood, and how people in that neighborhood take care of each other. And not to say, and I don't want to dismiss the problems in the downtown east side. They can be really challenging, and people experience a lot of negative consequences. But there is also a sense of community there that I think is important to acknowledge and to uphold, and to say, and how can we build that kind of community in other neighborhoods? And there is no answer to that other than working on it. Because again, every group of people is different. So what works in one neighborhood or one area will be different than another. But thinking about it and talking about it is really important.
I think block parties are such a great aspect of that, really knowing your neighbors' names. It feels like our 7 o'clock cheer is always like a 5-minute block party where we're waving at our neighbors. Our neighbor has a bagpipes that he comes and brings out. I just want to get to Erin's question. She doesn't have a mic, but I think this is really important. Also, Judy pointed out some resources. Her experience is oftentimes her staff is focusing on the actions of others, but that they perceive for not doing their part to prevent this, and are being rude to these individuals and complaining to her. She finds these reactions really draining. How do you set boundaries?
Yeah, and so the first thing that comes to my mind is helping people to reframe that, to understand there may be more and different motivations for a behavior than the person currently thinks of. So we often assume that other people's motivations are the worst and assume that ours are the best. And that's no judgment, that's human beings. I do it as much as anyone else. But helping them to see that there might be a multitude of different motivations that would lead to the same behavior can help them to reframe that it's not necessarily bad and maybe they don't have the whole story. The other thing I think you can do, and this is more around the boundaries, is to be clear with your team that that we need to talk about the positive things, and we need to work harder to notice the positive things that are happening. Like, did you notice the 90% of people that were maintaining social distancing, or sorry, physical distancing? And if not, why not? And part of that why not is we do have built into our brains a negativity bias. So we tend to notice the things that we judge negatively, and we tend not to notice the things that fit our definition of appropriate or good. And so, but we can change that. We can choose, when we see something we don't like, to look around and say, is that happening everywhere, or is that the exception? And again, at least in my experience during this pandemic, it's been the exception. And it's not that I've had days where I thought everyone was like jam-packed together and everyone was ignoring physical distancing. And then when I caught myself in that negative self-talk, I was able to kind of step back, take a broader perspective, and went, oh, I've been on the street for 2 hours and it's been 2 groups of people, but I've seen hundreds of people, right? Yeah. Some people need some help with that. And so as a leader, as a manager, sometimes you need to push that a little bit, hopefully gently at first. And then if that doesn't work, again, depending on your team structure, but one of the things I've done in the past that's been helpful is to start team meetings with successes or with positive news or something like that, so that we're framing the meetings in good things rather than starting out in the negative.
I have a movement I'd like to start. That's called High Five at 5. And one of the things I noticed is that when I'd get home, my wife would say, hey, how was your day? And I was so wrapped up in all the things that I hadn't done, I was really difficult for me to answer in a positive way. And so what Victoria and I started to do, and we haven't carried it on as much as I'd like, but ultimately is at the end of the day, say, what did we accomplish today? And it's amazing how hard it is to remember the things that you accomplished at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. or 11. And then, but when you bring them back, you go, actually, that was a pretty productive day. So share a hashtag High Five at 5. Can tag the chamber if you like, but I think that's super important to help you to have that differentiation from when you're at work and get going home. I want to just point out that Judy said that the newest school needs a new place for UBC students to gain hours towards graduation, no charge to New West. So I don't know if that's something that you can partner with, Michael, but might be super helpful. Let's see. Judging without knowledge, I think that's great. I'm just noticing that we're coming to the end of our time. Michael, I've really appreciated this conversation. My hope was that everyone would leave with a tip or some new awareness about mental health and maybe an approach that will help them. So I hope we've done that. Hopefully you've got some insight into maybe how we can continue to support this community. I think one of my favorite books that I read this year was How Emotions Are Made. Do you know that one by Lisa Barry Feldman?
I don't.
Well, it's one of the most fascinating things, and I'll leave this as a tip that maybe you haven't heard yet, is that apparently humans are actually really bad at interpreting what they're feeling. And so one of her tips was for reducing stress is be more articulate about what it is you're feeling. Instead of saying I'm feeling overwhelmed, you can say I'm feeling nervous about the meeting that I'm hosting today. And the difference is that it helps you to narrow the approach, so then you can actually have a response to it. Overwhelmed is something you can't really deal with, but being nervous about the meeting, you can deal with that more specifically. So it's a really wonderful book if you really like to delve into how emotions are made. It's fascinating research. Anyway, that was my big tip. I've been saving it to the end, so hopefully I didn't steal anybody's the thunder here. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time. Before we before we end, does anybody have any one last thing that they need to say or they want from Michael before we go? Give you a couple of seconds here. Just throw it in the chat or just unmute. Anything you need to say? Aaron says clapping hands. So there's that. Once again, everybody, I want to respect everybody's time. I know that it's demanding times now, and I just appreciate you all being here. Hopefully you can take what you've learned today and then pass it on to the people around you. I think that how we build community resilience is first we take care of ourselves, and we're making sure we're taking care of each other after that. So I think that it starts with you, Nadine. Make sure you're taking care of yourself, and then we can take care of each other. Michael, last word, what's making you optimistic right now?
Oh, the creativity I'm seeing in our staff team and my friend team, just figuring, people really reaching deep and coming up with brand new ways of being and working. And that gives me so much hope for the future.
Very good, Michael. Nadine, Jamie, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. Hopefully you found your time valuable. I just really appreciate you showing your support. And once again, I'm now over 1 minute. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. We'll see you all next week. Bye, everyone.